Well, terror group Hamas and Israel. See, BBC, how easy it is just to call them what they are. They agreed an extension to the pause in hostilities that lasted for 4 days for an extra 48 hours. Out of a total of 240 hostages believed to be held, 69 have now been released by Hamas in exchange for 150 Palestinian prisoners and detainees being released by Israel. Well, joining me right now, live from Tel Aviv, is author and journalist Douglas Murray, who has been in the country for some weeks. And actually, last time we spoke to you, Douglas, you had just been into Gaza yourself. You've also been to the scenes of the massacres in southern Israel around the kibbutzes and their festival as well, seeing a lot of this stuff firsthand. Just in terms of your perspective, Douglas, where we are right now, a 2-day ceasefire extension to the 4 days we've already seen, more hostages being released. There's lots of talk how, people want this to be extended, more aid getting into the Palestinians, more hostages being released. But does this look to you like anything close to the end of this conflict?
No, I don't think anyone thinks it's the end, apart from maybe abroad. Within Israel, it's very clear that the objective of destroying Hamas is some way off. Sinwar, who plotted the massacre, who of course was himself a previous swapped prisoner from an Israeli jail, is still alive. We actually now know that he met the hostages. But there's a very, very difficult game being played by Hamas, a very cunning game, which is that they sort of dribble out hostages, as we see in exchange for they hand over some Jewish children, and the Israelis hand over some people who, were in Israeli prisons for stabbing people or carrying bombs and so on. But they can sort of dribble this out for quite a long time. And we actually don't know, of course, how many hostages are alive or were alive when they were taken into Gaza. Hamas, like Hezbollah, sort of benefits from this uncertainty and knows that it could drag out a ceasefire for some time. Of course, the troops who are in Gaza, the Israeli troops and others, mainly want to get on with their mission. So I think it's a very frustrating time for Israel, simultaneously wanting as many of the hostages back as possible, but also wanting to pursue the objective of destroying Hamas.
Indeed, and this is interesting, that the moral pressure that is coming on Israel from actually the families of the hostages, many within Israel, but also the international community, including allies like Britain, like America, sort of pushing for this ceasefire. When we are talking about a country being basically asked to sort of not take on the terrorist group that has just murdered and slaughtered, I think the figure's been revised to 1,200 innocent civilians, and some Israeli forces as well seeking to defend them on October the 7th, taking those hostages, choosing still not to always stick to the rules, like, giving back mums and children together. The youngest hostage, 10-month-old baby, we understand, has been handed on to another terror organisation, and has not yet been returned. And they're carrying on like that. And yet, when it comes to the West dealing with Al-Qaeda or dealing with ISIS, I don't remember us taking this attitude at all. It was, these organisations are terror organisations, they are murderous organisations, they need to be destroyed. But for some reason, Hamas need to be treated differently.
That's right, Julia. I mean, there's no point in destroying Hamas a bit. There's no point in wounding Hamas or taking out a part of it. The objective of the war, from Israel's point of view, is to destroy Hamas. And that's what it has to do. Half destroying it isn't good enough. And I don't think the Israeli public will put up with that. It can't be stressed enough that, I mean, whilst outside there's sort of left and right and, all these different distinctions of politics, in Israel, I think the public are almost completely united in recognizing that Hamas needs to be destroyed and they cannot live beside it. Nobody can move back to the communities in the south if they're within reach of Hamas from now on. It was amazing how they got used to living beside Hamas in the past. Every house in the kibbutz, had a bomb shelter in it. Sadly, the doors didn't lock, which is why Hamas terrorists were able to go door to door and slaughter people and abduct people as they did. But they were too used to living with bombs. But nobody can live with bombs and rockets plus the threat of being taken hostage or murdered in your bed. So it's a very important thing that Israel, in my view, the Israelis are allowed to do what they need to do to destroy Hamas. But it's a very interesting point you just made, Julia, about the manner in which Hamas is releasing the hostages. I was at the Children's Hospital on Friday night when the first children were flown in from the first swap, and it's very striking the way that Hamas is releasing people. It is making sure very methodically that it keeps back at least one member of each family of the people that are being released. And there's several reasons for that. And one of them, of course, is that it means that the returnees have to be extremely careful about what they say about the nature of their captivity and exactly what was done to them or not done to them. It's a sort of hostage situation within a hostage situation. The children were meant to be returned with their family members, and they haven't done that. Hamas hasn't done that. And this is, of course, if I can just quickly say, this is a situation that we've seen ourselves in Britain in microcosm. You remember back in 2004 or so, the British hostage of Zarqawi in Iraq, Ken Bigley, who ended up being decapitated by Zarqawi and his jihadist group. But you'll remember that they eked out these videos of him in the days before the poor man's murder, in which they got him to, for instance, condemn the government of Tony Blair and much more. Hamas operate exactly the same way as Zarqawi and other jihadist groups. They know how to apply political pressure inside democracies, whilst, of course, not being remotely democratic.
And we, many people on this side, play along with it, the media included. I have to say one thing, and I'm sure you've been struck by this as well, even though you're over in Israel, seeing a lot of the international media and British media. The moral equivalence of is, hostages held by Hamas and detainees held by the Israel, as if these, children, there's women and children. You see some hulking 6-foot lad who's been detained because he's been throwing rocks, throwing stones, throwing rocks at soldiers. And you said people who've been convicted of stabbing, a woman who's released. She's got burns. Because she had a bomb. That's why she's got burns. But also as if that's equivalent to a 10-month-old being stolen from her bed and parents being murdered.
Let me give you a new low that happened today. The man called Dominic Waghorn, who's apparently Sky News' international affairs editor, he this morning said that that the fact that Sinwar had met the Israeli hostages and that they were not harmed undermines the Israeli Hamas equals ISIS storyline, he says. Dominic Waghorn goes on to say, the hostages, were held in reasonable conditions, reportedly, though those held above ground lived with the fear of being killed in Israel's bombardment. I mean, I wonder if Dominic Waghorn just works for Hamas at this point. I mean, it is such preposterous propaganda to put out. And I'm afraid that we've seen a lot of that. Journalists actually falling for the Hamas line, not realizing that what we know from the hostages who have been released is only what we know, and that they are allowed to say, knowing that they have abducted loved ones still underneath Gaza.
And we spoke to the uncle of 2 teenagers who were released, and their mother, they came out on Saturday to be told that their mother had been killed, that their father was still missing, believed to be being held by Hamas, hadn't been released. And when I asked, how they were treated, their uncle yesterday said to me, we just can't talk about that. We know there are other families that are also still missing loved ones, so we have to be very careful. And this is it. People aren't being talked about. I've seen commentators on social media saying, "Well, I mean, look, she's smiling. She obviously she's been grateful, thanking the masked man." Handing her over to the International Red Cross. She's clearly been well treated. No, this is a girl who thought she was being taken to be executed after spending 7 weeks in a tunnel with having been seized and watching her family executed and burnt alive around her. Being grateful that she suddenly discovered she's free. That doesn't mean that Hamas were nice to her. But the willingness of many in the West, including trained journalists, to take this stuff as legit and I would say borderline sick, actually.
I would say it's sick, but it's also, Julia, it's just frivolous. I mean, there's a terrible frivolity in the British media and much of the rest of the international media. I mean, don't forget, this is media who have spent recent years, many of the actual people sort of bigging up Hamas at the moment, are the sort of people who spent recent years boring us all with their claims about gender pronouns and other waffle. And you know, they tell us about things like microaggressions and all this boring nonsense. And a group like Hamas comes along, and they are as frivolous about them as they are about everything else in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely.